Alcohol and self-defense gun use. There's no need pretending like this never happens. It does. The question is, what does it look like and what do you need to know? I'm going to be answering those questions in today's video. So guys, let's get into it. So as a practicing criminal defense attorney with close to 30 attorneys that I get to work with, and as an attorney that deals with, at any point in time, between about 5 to 15 self-defense gun cases here at the firm, this is not something that is alien to us. And it's something I know a lot of you are often thinking about. Here's the way that I explain it to folks as if you called the office and talked to me. Cases have what I call hard factors and soft factors. A hard factor might be, very simply, were you privileged to use deadly force at the time that you pulled the trigger? So for the details of that, you need to check your state. So for instance, here in Wisconsin, whether or not you were in reasonable fear of imminent death or great bodily harm. If you can express that you were in reasonable fear of imminent death or great bodily harm when you pulled the trigger, then the hard factor is it shouldn't matter whether or not you have had drinks on board as it goes to your use of that deadly force. More on that in a moment. Those are the hard factors. Does your qualification for force count, or did you fail to meet that threshold? Now keep in mind, there's a lot of things that can play into that. Some states have duty to retreat, other states have stand your ground, you may have castle doctrine at play, you name it. So when it comes to those hard factors, how the alcohol will tend to play a role is it goes directly towards your credibility at that moment. If the entire case comes down to you versus a dead man with no other statements, no other witnesses, and all the forensic evidence tells us is that there were 2 shots, it was maybe about 10 feet, give or take, and it was to the front of their body. So it wasn't like you shot them in the side, in the back, or anything like that. 2 shots, center mass. Then let's be realistic here. If your statement is that they made a deadly threat against you, they had that knife with them, they're a known robber, been in and out of prison their whole life, it's going to be a bit of an uphill battle for even the most anti-self-defense, anti-gun prosecutors to try to say that, you know what, those drinks, those rewound a great statement in corroborating physical evidence at the scene. But most cases are not just that. Many cases have a lot of other factors, including numerous other witnesses, and you're going to get a different story for each and every single witness that is out there. If this happened on a busy street, a parking lot, something like that, you're going to get, if there's 10 witnesses, you're going to get 10 different stories. And I assure you, when gunshots go off and people turn around, they see you holding a gun and someone down on the ground, do you think people are going to automatically assume that you are the good guy or that the guy holding the gun is the bad guy? How are those 911 calls going to play and sound as a result when other people start calling it in? You have to be mindful of that. Likewise, most of the time, bad guys do not work alone. They typically work in groups, in my experience. Not every time, but most of the time, speaking as an ex-state prosecutor, criminal defense attorney. What that means is that if one of the other bad guys decides to not try to go to ground, so to speak, and instead they contact 911 or they give some sort of statement somehow, some way down the line that usually has you robbing them, and as absurd as that is, trust me, almost every single time, and I've been in this business for a while now, almost every single time a bad guy gives a statement, it's always that the good guy tried to rob them. Almost every single time. Your drinks, again, do not help you out. I am not suggesting that that is fair, but I am letting you know that this will play against you. How could that not help you out? Because the prosecutor is going to say what good, intentionally righteous person would leave their home, go out, have drinks while carrying. That is going to put you in a bad shadow. That is going to put you in a bad light with prosecutors. I don't care if you think that that's not fair. I'm not suggesting that that is fair. I am saying, however, that that is the standard that you can expect. Let's talk about 0.08 and the level of impairment. The reason why I say 0.08 is because a lot of people anchor on, of course, in the United States, the legal level for blood alcohol concentration while operating a motor vehicle on a public highway in most states and under most circumstances is 0.08. For an adult male, that's about 3 to 4 drinks, give or take. For an adult woman, that tends to be closer to about 3-ish, sometimes 2, sometimes 4. Again, this is all very fuzzy math. I am unaware of a state, now I've not researched this, but I'm unaware of a state that criminalizes intoxicated possession of a firearm based on what your blood alcohol concentration is. Instead, they criminalize the possession of firearms on the basis of whatever level you have in your bloodstream based on what your level of impairment is. So, the presumed level for impairment, generally speaking, 0.08. Why? Because the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, 0.08 as our last 30 years or so standard for what the legal limit for driving your car is. However, if there was a toxicologist sitting right here talking to you down the lens, they would say, look, I cannot determine if someone was impaired or sober based on looking at their blood alcohol concentration. And guys, I can absolutely corroborate that. I have seen people on video pass field sobriety tests at a 0.32, 4 times the legal limit. I have watched people fail field sobriety tests at less than half the limit. We all know that one person in your life who can have a shot of communion wine and be tipsy. We also all know that person who can put down a 12-pack in an hour or two and be stone sober. This is where that comes into effect. Now keep in mind, what I'm not talking about is the fact that many states criminalize having a firearm in a place where alcohol is served. They criminalize even having one drink at an establishment where alcohol is served while carrying. We're not talking about those sorts of things. We're not talking about drinking or possession in certain places laws. We're simply talking about possession of a firearm while having alcohol coursing through your bloodstream. That's what we're talking about. So my point is this. The prosecutor and frankly society is going to be hardwired to have a prejudice to think that if you're above 0.08 or even approaching 0.08, you're probably impaired even if you're not. Keep that in mind because again, it will play to your credibility of how you recount the events to the cops, to the judge, and if push comes to shove, to the jury as well. Really quickly, guys, thanks for joining us. Be sure to stick around to the end for a great Theodore Roosevelt quote of the day. Be sure to hit that like button if you've not already done so. My question for you in the comment section down below is this. What do you think about this? What do you think about mixing alcohol, firearms? Do you think the laws are messed up? Do you think that they're pretty much right on the money? Should things be moved? What are your issues? What are your beefs? Let me know down in the comment field down below. I look forward to reading through those. Now back to the video. Now I was talking about hard factors versus soft factors. So the hard factors are, at the end of the day, can the state meet its burden to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that you committed a homicide, you committed a manslaughter, whatever else the case may be? Some of the soft factors that play into that goes to things like credibility. But another big one is, where are you? So earlier I touched on the fact that, look, there's going to be a negative shadow cast across your credibility, your character, if you made the decision to go out and have some drinks, regardless of your level of impairment, but obviously the worse that is, the worse it's going to look for you from a credibility perspective. You made the decision to mix alcohol and firearms. Not a wise choice. But let's say that you're at home. You did not make the decision to mix alcohol and firearms. The person who made that decision was the bad guy who broke through your back door. The firearm was nowhere near you when you start to hear that crash or the crowbar cave in the window. You just did the only thing that you could do in that moment to save you and yours from the unknown that's coming through at midnight. You ran to your bedroom, you ran to your safe, to your closet, wherever it is, you grabbed the firearm, and you protected your life. Even if you're a Castle Doctrine or not, this is going to be a very different situation, to my mind, because the soft factors are going to be very different. My argument to the prosecutor, as a defense attorney, as well as to the judge, and should push come to shove to the jury, is going to be two things. Number one, that you never even set up, again, soft factors. You're not the one that mixed alcohol and firearms. The bad guy did, who broke in your back door. Number two, you are privileged by necessity at that point under the law, which is one of the recognized privileges, to my knowledge, in every single state, along with self-defense. A privilege, or what's called an affirmative defense, is an instance just like self-defense where you're saying, look, I'm not saying I didn't shoot that guy. I'm saying that I was privileged under law because I had a good reason to do so, such as self-defense again. So there are other examples of privilege. One of them here, or an affirmative defense, depending upon how your state calls it, is going to be necessity. Classic example, the necessity is middle of a snowstorm, my car broke down, I'm freezing to death, I broke into someone's cabin in order to stay warm. Did I trespass? Yeah. Did I commit criminal damage to property? Yeah. Was it a burglary? Maybe. But this was a necessity issue. Now, obviously, you got to pay the owners there, but you get the idea behind this. The necessity issue here is very straightforward. Obviously, you can see it. I had to possess this weapon despite whatever my blood alcohol concentration and level of impairment was in order to protect myself and my family against the person who decided to mix alcohol and firearms, which was not me. It was the bad guy. So what's the bottom line? The bottom line is that you're going to be on very different legal footing potentially, depending upon whether or not you left your home and you went out and consumed alcohol while in possession of a firearm versus you're in your own home or a situation like that, where you're not the one that mixed alcohol and firearms. The bad guy did. Different soft legal footing as far as going towards credibility and your level of decision-making. Was it good? Was it bad? As well as different legal issues involved. In other words, you may not have the argument for necessity if you left your house with a firearm and intentionally started drinking. Because at that point, hey, you may have had self-defense against the bad guy, but you may not have had necessity for now intoxicated possession of the firearm or something like that. Because where this winds up going is, often in my experience, if you have questionable self-defense or maybe good self-defense factors, regardless of whether or not the trigger is actually pulled, what prosecutors will sometimes go after you for is intoxicated possession of a firearm, recklessly endangering safety, sentencing factors, intentionally pointing a firearm, all that kind of stuff. Things that ratchet down the magnitude level of the case, again, assuming that no shots hit someone, and we're not talking about bodies in the ground in my experience. But now we're in a different arena. And the problem here is that you can try to claim self-defense, perhaps successfully, for intoxicated possession of a firearm. But if you didn't actually have to pull the trigger, then the prosecutor has a baked-in counter-argument for the reason why you did not have the privilege for self-defense yet. Hey, some guy started doing something, you produced a firearm prematurely, and the problem went away. How do I know it was premature? You never had to pull the trigger. We can agree right here, right now, that might be ridiculous reasoning because we know, according to government studies, that about 92% of the time when a good guy, when a victim produces a firearm in self-defense, the bad guy runs away. You know that. I know that. Your defense attorney almost certainly will not know that, and I assure you the prosecutor does not. This is what you're going to be up against. So, if you leave your house with a firearm and you start to consume alcohol, you could be forfeiting necessity privileges, which means you could be walking yourself perhaps out of a bad situation against the bad guy. I can hear it right now. I'd rather be judged by 12, carried by 6. I can see people typing that into the comment section. I'm not stopping you. Go ahead. All right. But you do need to be aware of the fact that the necessity issue is very real, and you could be forfeiting yourself to, depending upon your state, misdemeanor and felony level problems. And that's before we get back to what I touched on before, which is the fact it's illegal, sometimes by way of felony, to even possess a firearm in an establishment that is licensed to sell and on-site consume alcohol. Be mindful of those issues that are out there. So there you have it. Quick discussion of some hard factors versus soft factors. By the way, some other examples of soft factors might be, were you a jerk to the cops even if you said all the right things? Because that's not going to exactly give you a tailwind in your case. What's your background? In other words, are you known to law enforcement? Are you someone who, hey, again, maybe let's say you made a great shoot, but if the cops are always showing up because there's always problems at your house and they can never quite get you, do you really think that that gets you a tailwind again? Probably not. Do you have crazy social media that makes you look nuts with all sorts of different things? Do you have Punisher logos on your grips and all that kind of stuff? Again, these are things that all hurt you. These are all examples of soft factors that at the end of the day, let's make no bones about this. As a defense attorney, if I had you and let's say some of these soft factors went against you, I would be doing everything possible to focus your jury on whether or not you were privileged to use deadly force at the moment that you used it, whether you're privileged to draw that firearm out, even if you never had to pull the trigger. That's what I would be trying to push. But just as obviously, the prosecutor has a lot of other things they'll be pushing, and it's going to be up to the judge as to what the jury is going to be allowed to hear. I hope you found this brief conversation helpful. When I sat down in this chair, I did not intend to film this. I kind of just went off on it because I saw this question pop up on my Twitter feed. By the way, be sure to check me out on Twitter at ATTY Tom Grieve, short for attorney Tom Grieve. And I figured that I'd make a video to respond to it. So appreciate it. Appreciate you sticking around to the end. Let's check out our quote of the day. This one comes from Theodore Roosevelt, one of my favorites. President Roosevelt once said, "Do what you can with what you have where you are." Great advice, something that we all need to remember every day. And I'll see you in the comment section down below, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks for sticking around to the end of the video. If you enjoyed this one, please feel free to check out some of our other great content, and we'll see you in the next one.